Welcome in. This is Hype Factor, a Fantasy Critic podcast for all the Fantasy Critic enthusiasts out there who just can't get enough of talking about Fantasy Critic. I am Jon. I am joined by my good friend Marcus.
Hi, Jon. I'm very excited to be here. Can't wait to get talking Fantasy Critic with you tonight, my friend.
Yeah, this is amazing. A long time in the making, and I don't know where you want to start with this. We know we have some stuff that we do want to talk about tonight, but what are we doing here? What the heck is going on? I don't know.
Well,
I don't know where you want to start with this. But talking about this podcast.
I think maybe we should start about talking about the origins of the podcast. I remember, so Jon and I had, maybe for all the listeners out there, Jon and I had the opportunity to help manage and coordinate some fantasy leagues in the carpool gaming community this past year. And Jon happened to just mention the idea of, wouldn't it have be great to have a show that focused on Fantasy Critic? And I jumped at the idea. I was like, let's do this. I think this is a fantastic idea. I have, and Jon will probably get into it as well, but I have kind of a long history of fantasy sports. So when this Fantasy Critic for video games came up, kind of combining two real passions in my life, I was like all in on Fantasy Critic. So the prospect of making content and creating a podcast that focuses exclusively on Fantasy Critic, I was like, yeah, I think this is a fantastic idea. So I was all in as soon as you brought the idea up, Jon.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I think part of the reason for it was, I've been playing Fantasy Critic for, I would say, 3 years now. And I remember when I first started out being like, I did what I did with fantasy football, right? You kind of go and try and see like what is the best strategy, or what are the tips and tricks. And there is not that much out there. I think a lot of people have covered it in their own individual communities, but nothing kind of dedicated to like what should your approach be. So that was kind of the inspiration behind it. But yeah, it's been a bit of a year in the making since we had that initial conversation. And yeah, excited to be here. Excited to kind of get this going. I'll talk a little bit in this episode about what this show is going to be. But maybe first, Marcus, before we kick off, maybe you can tell us and the listeners a little bit about your own experiences with Fantasy Critic. How did you get started, and what's your experience been like so far?
So yeah, I think I was around as soon as Fantasy Critic started. So I don't know if it's much longer than 3 years, probably maybe 4 or 5-ish years.
I think publicly it's been available since 2019. So yeah, this is the probably the fifth year.
Yeah, I think I've been around since the start. It was actually a good friend, Kyle Stevenson, one of the co-hosts of the Trophy Room podcast, had found out about it and had posted kind of like a call for anybody interested in a fantasy league for video games. And I was like, "Yep, sign me up." I was probably one of the first people to sign up, and I've been kind of locked in ever since. I play probably in at least two leagues a year. I think this year I'm in 3 different leagues and different communities. I love it. I've been I want to say fortunate, but I'm actually pretty good at it too. So I think that, kind of making some sense as to why I wanted to kind of jump in there and maybe share some of the tips and strategies that I've kind of come up with over the years. And like I said off the top, I've been a big fan of fantasy sports. I've kind of maybe drifted off the fantasy sports, but this has kind of filled that gap in the last few years. And yeah, I just love it.
Yeah, and for me, my first league, I guess, was 3 years ago now. It was soon after joining Play Some Video Games podcast community in their Discord, and it was an opportunity to just learn more about gaming. It was kind of getting back into the hobby, and it was really kind of taking a different step in terms of my connection to gaming. And this was really an opportunity to get closer to community members, but also learn more about the industry that I was kind of loved and engage with it in a really different way. So I really jumped at that opportunity. That year there was, I think, over 16 people, and I was really overwhelmed. So you can tell why the need for some strategic advice was necessary. But since then, I feel like you, I've been all in. I've been in multiple leagues since that point in the last 2 years. Hopefully, finding some success in those leagues, and just really enjoy talking about it. It's a little bit of maybe backstory for the listeners is you and I also regularly before this podcast through this last year have been also messaging back and forth, sharing our thoughts on how the league is going, how the season's going, and so this is a chance for us to do the same thing, but kind of bring it to the public. So yeah, really excited to get going with this journey of ours.
Yeah, and I think like we fill a niche that isn't really out there. We kind of mentioned it a bit earlier, but there isn't really anything like that. And again, if we look at fantasy sports as a comparable, there are a million fantasy football or fantasy baseball podcasts out there, fantasy hockey for us Canadians. John and I are from Canada, so like there's just nothing like that. And our goal really with this show, I would say, is to bring that type of a experience, that type of a show, to the fantasy critic community. Because really, at least to our knowledge, there's nothing out there that exists like that. So
And maybe one day there will be. Look forward to it. Where I hope this awesome game, this Fantasy Critic initiative, continues to grow, and the community continues to grow, and it continues to flourish. So yeah, very excited. Maybe we'll take a quick second to talk about what this show will be and explain to everyone what they're going to be listening to. I don't know, Marcus, if you wanted to kick us off, and we can just kind of give our insights and our thoughts about what the listeners will be listening to.
yeah, so I think that broadly speaking, we've got some plans to do a monthly show, and we're going to probably have topics that we kind of do a deep dive on. We've got some kind of interesting plans, I think, figuring out maybe some games and previewing kind of like upcoming games and stuff like that. Basically, this is a fantasy focused show. We want to obviously talk about games that are great games, but we're always looking at everything that we are going to be talking about through a fantasy lens. And specifically, these next first two shows that we're going to put together here are getting you ready, getting the listeners ready for the fantasy season. So the purpose of the show that we're going to do here today is to get new players familiar with the rules and how Fantasy Critic actually works. We're kind of go through all the basics, and I think that that'll give people a really good handle about, maybe they've heard about Fantasy Critic before, but they've been maybe a little bit too nervous to jump in. Well, this hopefully will give you a bit of a base to be able to feel confident about jumping into your first Fantasy Critic league.
Yeah, and our second episode we hope will be very much draft focused. So talking about draft strategies, looking at how players should be approaching the draft. Again, Marcus mentioned it'll be on a monthly basis, so we expect the second episode will come out early in 2025. That'll allow players to listen, prep, and maybe get some ideas of how they want to approach the upcoming Fantasy Critic season. We do also have some ideas for segments once we get into a regular rotation, with looking back at the month that was, as well as looking ahead, talking about potential waiver wire pickups, some sleeper picks, other things that might be surprising for players. Essentially, sharing the research that we've been doing on the side with the broader public. So maybe not the best strategic move for our own Fantasy Critic seasons, but it's worth it. So
It's a sacrifice I will admit, John.
Nice, nice. So as Marcus mentioned, this first episode we're going to focus in on essentially the basics of Fantasy Critic. So Marcus, I'll hand it over to you to kind of get us started, and talk about some high level points about what Fantasy Critic is. What is this thing that we're talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've kind of talked about fantasy as if this is something that already people should know, but they may not know coming into listening to this for the first time, right? So really the basics is Fantasy Critic is a website, fantasycritic.com. I should probably
Fan-
know this off the top of my head.
Fantasycritic.games, which is
Dot
even better.
games, dot
Yeah.
games. Okay. Basically, it is a means of a little friendly competition that you may have with your friends or people in any of the communities that you partake in. And basically, your goal is to build a roster of video games. And based on the reviews that those games get, you get a score. And so, what your goal is to get the highest score that you can over the course of a calendar year. Okay. So, that's kind of the high level what Fantasy Critic is. Does that kind of lay it out for the folks that listening, John?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I think that's, anybody that's participated in a fantasy sports league in the past will definitely have an idea of how this works. And for those that are new, trust me, we're going to go through everything, and you're going to feel much more confident about your engagement with Fantasy Critic once we're done here.
Yeah. So, and I probably should say, so these leagues can vary in size. So we can have, anywhere. I think the league gives you, or the site gives you the option of be anywhere from 2 to 20 players. There's always going to be like a commissioner, kind of the leader of the league, who sets up the league, goes onto the website and sets up the league. Probably sends you an invite, or kind of a general invite in whatever community that you're going. So you take that invite, and then you create your team. Usually, I think the site refers to it as a publisher name. So basically, it's just a team name for your roster of games that you're going to get. Maybe now it makes a little bit of sense to get into some scoring. Like, how exactly do you accumulate points for your roster? I'll just maybe high level. The higher the review score, the more points you get. Okay, so that seems pretty simple, I would say. But maybe more specifically, we can say the way that the scoring works, for every point above a 70 that a review gets, and actually we should take it maybe a step back and say these reviews are based on the OpenCritic website. And OpenCritic is an aggregator. Probably more people are a little bit more familiar with Metacritic, but it works exactly or very similarly. So it takes reviews from all over the place and gives them a score, and it aggregates it to get one score number for that game. So for every point that goes above a 70 score, you get 1 point. But for every point below a 70 score, you lose 1 point. So maybe give you kind of a couple of examples. So if a game happens to review and it's got a score of 75 on OpenCritic, that means you get 5 points for that game. Conversely, if that game scores 65 points, that means you get a -5 for your score. So obviously, that 70 is kind of a midpoint. You're trying to want at least to have positive points. You want to have games on your roster that are getting at least 70 points or more. Does that all make sense? All straightforward, John?
Yeah, yeah. I think the only thing I'd add with the Open Critic, uh, good website to refer to if you're kind of jumping into this and understand how it works. And then I believe they need a minimum of 3 review scores in order to lock in an actual point total on Fantasy Critic. So any games that don't get a total of 3 reviews actually won't receive a score.
Right. Right. Definitely something to consider with some maybe smaller games down the road that may only get 1 or 2 reviews. That doesn't do you any good, even if those reviews are really stellar. So something to keep in mind for sure. Now, there are a few situations where the score is actually calculated a little bit differently than what we've just outlined here. So, and that is if the game scores really well, that is above 90, or really poorly, that is below 60. So we'll start with the above 90s first. So if a game scores greater than 90, every point above 90 is worth 2. So for example, a game that scores 93 will get you 26 points. That's 1 point for every point between 70 and 90, plus 2 points for every point above 90. So that's 3. Doing some quick math in my head. So 26 points, right? The scoring is even a little bit more complicated for if you get a really bad score. So below 60, I think it's probably just easiest to describe. You can kind of go on Fantasy Critic's website to get all the way it calculates it. But basically, for every point below 60, it's worth a little less than a point. So if you get a game, heaven forbid, you get a game that scored like 58, you wouldn't lose 12 points. You'd lose like 11 point something points. Now, if a game on your roster doesn't receive a score like the one that we outlined, or if the game doesn't come out, so it didn't get like a review at all, even though you still got it on your roster, that's a 0. So you don't lose points, you don't gain points, you just get 0. Do I have anything else before we get into the whole counter picks, John?
I think you covered it off. I think you covered
Okay.
it off. I think counterpick is probably going to be the most tricky part of this, and I think that's what we want to really get people interested in is this counterpick.
The counterpick is definitely a different. There's nothing like this in fantasy sports, so I think it's kind of it tends to be something that is a little bit trickier for people to grasp initially, at least, right? So counter picks, most leagues make each player make at least one counter pick. Now there's, they can have some real variations, but usually that's a pretty standard format where you have, in addition to the games that are on your team that are counting positive points that you would draft traditionally in the scoring that I've just outlined, they also make you pick one counter pick. And maybe as the name implies, the counter pick kind of works in the opposite way of a traditional pick. In the scoring is kind of the opposite. So what you want to do is choose games that you think will do poorly, and that will get you points. And the other thing about counter picks is what you're actually picking is you're picking a game from one of the other players' rosters. So what you want to do is you take a look at other people's rosters and you think, I don't think that game is going to do very well. I want to pick it. And the scoring works like this. So maybe I'll give you a bit of an example. So we can look at maybe a game that came out last year that didn't do so well, but John thought it might do really well. And this is Suicide Squad. So John drafted Suicide Squad and
Definitely
it came,
not.
and I
Definitely
was,
not.
well, let's just assume that John drafted Suicide Squad. And so I, in my infinite wisdom, decided that I didn't think Suicide Squad was going to do particularly well. I think that it was probably going to review much worse than 70. So I make it my counter pick. Suicide Squad comes out. It gets, I don't actually know where it settled, but I think it was around a 60, high 50s. Yeah, somewhere in that. Let's just, for easy math, let's just say it ended up with a 60 on Open Critic. So that means John's got it on his regular roster as a regular pick. He gets minus 10 points for Suicide Squad. But because counter picks work opposite, I get plus 10 points for my roster. Um, the other thing maybe to make note is that counter picks, when they're made, are locked in to the other person's roster. So we will talk about this in a little bit about kind of being able to add or drop games. But if a game is been counterpicked, there's only kind of one exceptional situation in which you might be able to drop it, and we'll get into that as well later. So it's kind of stuck on that person's roster. So it's kind of a way to, I don't know, screw over your other players in your league a little bit by making a bunch of counter picks, because then it kind of locks the roster a little bit more than they have less flexibility kind of moving forward. So, but you also want to be careful about it, right? Because you don't want to counterpick a game that ends up scoring really well. So sometimes it can be a little tricky because people don't tend to draft games that they think are going to do poorly. So
Yeah, if it scores well and it, as Chico was above 70, then you in
the
turn
person
are
that made the
losing.
counter pick ends up losing the points.
Yeah.
Exactly. Um, I think that is everything that I've got in terms of counter picks and scoring. Have I missed anything, John?
No, I think like you've nailed it because I think the majority of leagues that we've participated in, I think that is a pretty typical setup in terms of how the scoring works. There are some variations like you mentioned, but
Mm-hmm.
and we'll go through some of them, but for the most part that's a pretty typical league setup. I'm going to take the next couple minutes to talk about the draft. We're going to download a lot of information on you, so bear with us, but having led a couple leagues in the past, I think both Marcus and I recognize that, setting this up and giving listeners a chance to understand the rules of the game before they engage in a draft or engage in a league is probably really advantageous rather than trying to explain it all on the night that they're actually participating in the draft. If you've ever participated in any kind of fantasy sports league before, you'll probably be familiar with the importance of the draft itself, the general rules, the format we're going to talk about. It is a pinnacle moment in the season, so a lot of things kind of happen leading up to the draft. Usually, the league manager or commissioner will have set all the rules for your league, including how many games will be drafted versus how many games will be picked up via the waiver wire. So, this is really important because it's going to tell you how much or how little prep you may need to do beforehand. As we mentioned earlier, Marcus and I will do a bit of a deeper dive on draft strategy in the next episode, including probably going over your counter pick strategy. So stay tuned for more on that. The league manager will also establish categories of games or league rules that will be in play. And it's probably a good idea to review those and kind of understand them before you get started.
It's crucial, really. I think
Yeah.
it's so important. I think it's something that people can often overlook is not really paying close attention to the league rules before
Mm-hmm.
they even start to draft. And I think like it's something that's relatively simple and probably obvious in hindsight, but it's something that's can get overlooked. So
Yeah.
take a look at your league rules and how the draft is set up before you jump in.
Especially for newer players, right? People that aren't necessarily familiar with what to look for. I think that's critical. When you're establishing the draft, the league manager is probably going to pick, well, we'll have to pick a draft date and time. And there's kind of two ways to do this. It can either be done uh, live, where each person has kind of a set amount of time. Everybody joins at the same time. They have a set amount of time to make their selections, and or this can be done uh, remotely via auto draft, where each individual player is presetting their selections, and then the outcomes are auto populated. The league manager is also going to randomize draft order. This is kind of a high recommend, rather than trying to appease everyone. I think most leagues that we've been in, there is a randomizer that makes sure it's kind of fair in terms of who's going to select first and who's going to select last. And then whether it's a set time or whether it's an auto draft, league manager kind of requires it needs to actually take the physical step of starting the draft at the established date and time. When that happens, regardless if it's live or an auto draft scenario, the first player up will choose their first game, and after that, each player will follow suit. And then after every player has their first game selected, the individual that chose last in the first round will then choose first in the second round. So this is a very typical snake draft format that you find in fantasy football or other types of fantasy leagues for the most part. And it continues there until you've selected all the games that have been identified by the league managers. So if they've identified that you need to draft five games, it will continue on until that is completed. Once every player has drafted all their games, then that's when they make their counter pick selection that Marcus was identifying before. Something to consider that I've noticed, I don't know if this is an adjustable rule or not by the league manager, but in all the leagues that I've participated in, the player that chose last overall typically chooses their counter pick first. So there is an advantage to going last in the draft. And I would be mindful of this, as those counter picks are so critical to your overall season performance. So for all those new players out there, you might be thinking, oh my God, so many games to choose from. It really sounds overwhelming. These guys are dropping a lot of information on me. But I would just say, for anybody new to the Fantasy Critic website, the site makes it very easy to participate, even if you are new. They do provide you, when you're logged in, you kind of have your publisher name and everything set up, which I think you only need an email in order to participate.
I
It's
think that's right.
free.
Yep.
It's completely free. You just need the email set up. They do provide you a list of games which are pre-registered in the system. You can see this either before the draft or while the draft is going on. And they can be sorted. You can either manually sort them, or you can just see what it's pre-populated as, and then you can sort it by their overall hype level, which will give you a good sense of what people are thinking about that particular game. Their projected point total, which we'll talk about one day, probably less valuable as a resource, but still an interesting tool. And release date, so you can actually see if they've already identified a release date or not. It'll even tell you, the site will even tell you the percent that those games are drafted and counterpicked. That will be a very good indicator. So if you're new and not sure how to do this research or where to go with things, you can rely on the site to help you out. I'll also just add, you can imagine with all the games out there that are released over the course of a year, you may have things that you want to add or pick that are not on the list. I would just say there is a process when you engage with the Fantasy Critic community, whether through the website or the subreddit or Discord. There is a way to have games that you might want to select added to the games list. In a year with the Switch 2 soon to be released, this might be a very popular option this year. So just for anybody listening, you can make it as creative as you want to be with rumors or the like. Did I miss anything? That's a lot. That's a lot to download on people. But
I think you did a pretty good job. I would just one thing about the draft that I would be a strong advocate for is John mentioned that we could do the draft live, or you can set up an auto draft to make the system make your picks for you. I implore everybody to do their best to try to attend a live draft, because this is some of the most fun part of all fantasy, is kind of getting together in a Discord call and making the picks and seeing each other's picks and trash talking each other's picks. And I think it's just it's a lot of fun and kind of almost one of the highlights of the kind of fantasy season. So if you can at all make the live draft time that your league has set up, I would strongly advocate for that. It's a lot more fun than just sitting there and ranking all of your games ahead of time and just letting the system make the picks for you based on those rankings.
yeah, I agree. For me, like I remember whether it was joining a fantasy football league to maintain some relationships I had through my youth, and like continuing them on later on, and actually learning more about the NFL. Like that was one of the reasons I started in fantasy football. I found a lot of the same themes, priorities kind of carrying over into Fantasy Critic. It's allowed me to kind of continue building relationships within the communities I'm in. It is a great way to learn about the game industry and kind of what's coming out that year, like things that you will find that you are learning more about indie games through this process than you ever imagined you would. And it actually helps you identify kind of things that you even want to play. So there's so much value in kind of like embracing it. And I think like part of that live draft is really critical to that experience. So yeah, absolutely, I echo that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Marcus, why don't we move on to the waiver wire, because I know that's the kind of the next stage of this thing, and I think it'll be interesting for people to understand how they round out their rosters.
Yeah, so like as John explained, we have a draft where we will draft, a certain number of games to each player's roster, and but that's not all. Usually there are additional roster slots that are not drafted, so they're open slots on every team, kind of after the draft is done. So you've got all these open slots. Well, how do you fill them? And that's where the waiver wire comes in. So the standard rules of Fantasy Critic make use of a secret bidding system for the waiver wire. So basically, maybe I should take a step back. I think what maybe the best way to say is there's going to be a whole bunch of games that are still available that
Mm-hmm.
haven't been drafted, right? And so you have the opportunity to add games. And the secret bidding system is kind of the standard way in which that happens. Okay, so here is how standard bidding works. At the start of the year, each player is allotted a $100 budget to bid on games that they'd like to add to their roster. So let's say there's a game that you wanted to draft but didn't for whatever reason. Maybe you had other ones that were high priority, but you're still really keen on these games. You do have the ability to bid on that game using some of your, or all, I suppose, but at least some of your $100 budget to add that game to your roster. But because these games are just on the waiver wire, so does every other player in the league. They can all have the opportunity to bid on any game that is available or hasn't been drafted. To add a game, you need to put in a bid using some of your budget. So, for example, maybe there's a game that I'm interested in. I might put a bid of use $10 of my entire $100 budget. Other players can do the same with any game that they're wanting to do. They can put in a bid for the game. What each player bids on is secret. So you don't know what games they're bidding on or what those bids might be. And so you really have no idea what other people are doing. And then what happens is, like, on Saturday night every week, the bids are processed. If two players happen to bid on the same game, the player that bids the highest amount of dollars gets that game added to their roster, and they lose the money from their budget that they bid on the game. If you place a bid and you didn't happen to be the highest bidder for that game, you don't lose the money that you've bid, right? If there's a game, so as you know, in terms of strategy, if there's a game that you really want on your roster, you want to make sure that you're bidding a high enough amount to get it. But at the same time, you're having to keep in mind, well, I've only got $100 of a budget to bid on games throughout the whole year. So there's kind of a strategy involved in how you do your bids. Now you have the ability to fill out your roster immediately after the draft, but you also can wait to add games throughout the year. And we'll talk strategy as this podcast continues on throughout the year. But I will say that it is important to make sure that you have the ability to add games to your roster later in the year. So again, it really does depend on what your league rules setup are, but you don't want to necessarily just fill out all of your games right at the start. If at least if you don't have the ability to easily kind of move games in and out, because there are games that get announced, you know, months into the year that are still coming out in that given year that could score really well. A good example of this past year is Astrobot.
Mm-hmm.
Astrobot wasn't announced until, I don't know, I think it was Summer Games Fest
Summer.
ish.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it came out in September, and it might be the highest reviewed game of the year, if
It's
not the
close to.
highest, one of the highest. Yeah, so you want to be able to make room on your roster for those types of games. So that's something to keep in mind. What else do I want to say? I think that's it with secret bidding. Have I missed anything in terms of the secret bidding process, John?
No, I think that's great. Yeah, the Saturday night slot is an interesting one because you can kind of tell every week when things kind of peak in terms of interest, seeing what people are doing. But otherwise, no, I think you covered everything.
Okay, so that's secret bidding, and I did want to mention because it was a feature that was added to the website. I want to say 2 years ago. Is this idea of public bidding, and so public bidding is an option that some leagues take advantage of, and the mechanics of the bidding process are basically the same as secret bidding in that you still have to put in a bid for a game, except as the name implies, the bids are public. They are public in that the your league's website will mention which game has been bid on and by whom, but not the actual bid amount. So you still don't know how much that person has bid. And really, this is a feature to make it a little bit easier, I think, for the people at the bottom of the league to be
Yeah.
able to keep tabs on what the people at the top of the league might be doing. And because I think like oftentimes what happens is the people that are sitting at the top of the league or kind of in the standings kind of higher up, they might be a little more sneaky is probably not the right word, but they try to get some under the radar sort of picks, and this kind of prevents them from being able to do that. So like if they happen to get a hot tip or they read a story or a tweet, saw a social media post on a particular game that might be coming out that is from a well-known developer or something like that, they might put a quick bid in there. And if in secret bidding, there's nobody will have any idea that bid has been made. But at least in the public bidding, people will know or have the opportunity to know that that those bids are happening on those games, right?
With the public, what I've heard is that the public bidding system is actually really good when you have a lot of new players. It really helps level the playing field because not everybody's going to be as engaged with every single video game news announcement that happens either daily or weekly. And so it helps level the playing field a little bit. It is helpful for newer players. Some prefer it. I was reading this evening that there's a way to cheat around it and kind of hide what you're bidding on, which is awesome. That I just learned about this evening, and I kind of wish I had come up with it. But we'll talk about that in another episode. But it is a unique feature to the site for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a good point because I think like there's nothing more frustrating. And I can certainly see I wouldn't consider myself a new player by any means, but like is something frustrating when you see somebody put a bid and there was nobody else that bid against them. They picked up a game that you would have really liked, but for whatever reason you missed it. You forgot that it had just come out, or that the release date had come out, and you just didn't have a chance to 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 know that anybody else would be bidding on that game. And so the public bidding at least has the opportunity to increase your awareness of what the heck is going on. And I think like leveling the playing field is a really good way to kind of describe it. So we'll see. I think like I don't know if any of the three leagues that I'm playing are using public bidding this year. So I'm not sure that it's the most as much in favor, but
Yeah.
um, it definitely has its pros for sure.
I've done it once. It definitely changes the way you kind of have to approach things, and not my preferred approach, but interesting because it is a different type of challenge for sure.
Yeah. And so really that's the basics of the waiver wire and adding games to your roster. And I think I would say that this is probably one of the most, maybe the most important aspect of Fantasy Critic. The draft is fun, as we've described. But it's relatively straightforward. You're just adding games all in one night to your team. But the waiver wire is where you add games throughout the year, and that's where leagues are really won. So every year that I play in, there are multiple players in leagues that don't fill out their rosters, and at the end of the day, it's pretty tough to win a league when you only have half of a roster
Yeah.
filled. So you have to take advantage of the waiver wire. You have to make some ads throughout the year to be able to fill it out and win your league. So waiver wire is really important.
Remind me to tell you next month about why that statement is never more true. That was
Yep.
so true. I'm going to quickly talk about some rule variations. So, the one beautiful thing about the Fantasy Critic website is that it is really customizable for individual leagues. It gives you a lot. It gives the league manager and the individual leagues a lot of choice, kind of how you want to structure it. And this customizability, I really find, kind of like allows you to increase the difficulty. It's almost like it is a video game. It keeps the league fresh, and it allows you to scale the difficulty for seasoned players. Really, really interesting stuff. So some of the rule variations that we'll kind of just quickly talk about is the drop feature. So as Marcus mentioned, as you're adding games through the actual calendar year, you're bidding on games to fill out your roster. You also may have games that have been either delayed into another calendar year, or you just have soured on it and don't think it's actually a good choice. And so you're going to want to drop it to make way for a better option. Fantasy Critic website allows you to essentially customize how that works. You could have unlimited number of drops, which is kind of a free for all form. It can also You can also have it customized so that the number of dropped games is limited. That can be further narrowed by limiting will not release droppable games, i.e., the game is not going to release that year, and you can actually say the number of drops for that category, or will release games. So it actually has an upcoming release date, and you want to drop it because you're not high on it anymore. And so you can really customize that functionality, which really can adjust your approach to Fantasy Critic. It might really negate how you actually fill out your roster early in the season versus later in the season when the risk of adding games that might get delayed is greater. So really something interesting, and I've played in both versions, and it really does kind of shape the way you approach it. In a league where you have unlimited drops, you're really just filling it out with all your best predictions early in the season, and you can kind of make the adjustments as you go. Versus other leagues where you probably really want to wait. To Marcus's earlier point about what might come out that year, like an Astrobot, you really want to wait. The other feature is super drops. So a super drop allows a player to drop any of their games immediately, even if the game has already released. So it's a feature that I've not personally engaged with. It's not something that the leagues that I've participated in have used, but it essentially allows you to drop counter picks. It allows you to drop a game that has a score, and it's really meant to Marcus's earlier point to allow, let's say, not doing so well, to actually have a chance to catch up to those kind of league leaders. And
Yeah,
with
I
the
would say
option,
I would just add that I think there's I don't know actually what the threshold is, but it might be like the bottom half or the bottom third.
yeah,
If you choose the option um to allow a super drop in your league, it's only available to the bottom
yeah.
portion of the league because do you have it right there in front of you?
I'm checking the site, and basically, it's essentially if you enable it, it's starting September 1st of a given year. Any player that has less than 65% of the projected points of the player with the most projected points will just be given a super drop automatically. So you kind of two functions. You can set it up that this is an automatic super drop functionality where those that are kind of at the bottom end of the league automatically get this feature September 1st forward. So at any point from September 1st onward in a calendar year, if they fall behind that 65% threshold, they automatically are granted a soup drop. The other way it can happen is a league manager can kind of switch it on for anybody kind of at the bottom of the list. So, it is meant to kind of help, again, level the playing field. I've not engaged with it, but it is one of those things that is a nice functionality, just to help make people still feel engaged, right? Because sometimes you do enter September, October, and it's kind of like a done deal as to who's might walk away with it and who might not. So
Yeah, and I think that Fantasy Critic is the full calendar year. When we played in our fantasy sports league, it's always a season, and a season,
mhm.
a season of NFL is what 4 5 months at the most, 4 months ish. Baseball is obviously a little bit longer, but so they're not the full year, so it's a long season. So sometimes people can maybe lose a little bit of interest, particularly if they're further behind the
Mhm.
leaders. They're like, well, why am I doing this? Super Drop helps create a bit more of an incentive to allow those players that are near the bottom to still catch up, because you can literally, as John said, you can take, if you happened to pick a game that scored use our Suicide Squad
Suicide
example,
Squad, yeah.
right, and it gave you minus 11 points. Well, you can super drop it, and now you've taken that off your roster. That's a potentially a big jump for you.
Yeah.
So
It's a huge
um,
swing. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And you mentioned earlier about counter picks. So like in the leagues that we've participated in, counter picks are, it locks in essentially someone with that selection for the season. There is a functionality though that you can kind of simplify it. I think a league manager can just set it so that counter picks are droppable. Not
Oh,
for the
okay,
individual that chose it.
right.
If you chose a counter pick, that's your choice for the season. But from what I understand, you can kind of drop it at any point.
Yeah. Again, all of these things are important to know your league rules,
Yeah.
because
And some leagues will also allow you, like some leagues will actually require additional counter picks through the season. Like that's the other kind of customizable features. They may actually require additional counter picks to be made in year, which is another feature that kind of also makes you a little bit more cautious with your waiver wire pickups, right? If someone can actually now,
yep.
a lot of times what I'll do is kind of leave my riskier choices till after the draft to make sure that no one can counterpick them. But if you do have in-year counterpicks or additional counterpicks that are selected, you kind of have to watch for that. So again, lots of customizability. The other thing to be really, I think, aware of is game eligibility. So at the start of the year, we talked about the league manager setting up the rules. They will essentially identify which game categories are eligible for selection and which ones are not. And I think this is, again, a critical thing to be aware of when you're starting out. Check out your league options, and there's a number of them. It's a pretty long list, so I'm not going to go through all of them. Just to give you a little taste of what it looks like, though, you have new gaming franchises or remasters, you have DLC or director's cuts, you have annual iterations of games. So you can imagine just there are a host of different types of game eligibility that could be eligible for selection or could not be. And you can imagine with something like DLC, we saw this year with Shadow of the Erd Tree, for example, it can make a real difference if DLC is eligible for selection or not. The other thing this category allows you to do, and in one of the leagues I'm participating in right now, it's we have this toggled on, and it really makes it interesting. Is the league manager can actually set it so that certain game categories actually need to be filled out as part of your roster. So you actually are required to have one of your games be DLC. You're actually required for one of your games to be a new gaming franchise or multiples. And this really, again, changes the dynamic. It kind of keeps the league fresh. It can increase the difficulty because it changes the way you're drafting. It can change the way you're selecting games off the waiver wire and how people are viewing what you have available. I know I've regularly monitored kind of my opponents in that league to understand kind of what they have left, what they still need to fill out, and changes kind of how I approach the waiver wire. So really interesting stuff. The last thing is trades. Anybody again familiar with fantasy sports will know that trades can be a highlight. It can be toggled on or off in this league, and as long as you kind of have that relationship with your kind of league mates, it might be something that's really fun to explore. So you know. Uh, really, really, I just can't emphasize enough how the customizability that they've built into this website kind of provides a level of entertainment, a level of engagement that is really unique, and probably even more unique than the fantasy sports I've engaged with in the past. So did I miss anything, Marcus? Anything that
I think you
you
got it
want?
all. I think you got it all, John. I don't have anything else. Yeah, I think we got it all. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. I mean, as part of this, I think one of the things that we do want to call out, because we're obviously doing this podcast. We're going to be doing it once a month, and it gives us an opportunity to connect, which is great because I've really enjoyed the chances we've had to talk about Fantasy Critic, and I'm really excited to kind of have this broader conversation and share with kind of our friends and the broader communities we're part of, kind of engage with Fantasy Critic as well. But I think none of this would be possible without kind of calling out the founders of Fantasy Critic. So we talked about the website before. That's fantasycritic.games, and the website's awesome. It has the rules really laid out. It has a really interesting about section, which will give you a story about the history of the site, and just a special shout out to Steve Fallon, who, if you're in his Discord, I think he goes by Elite Fusion. It's just it is a really you can feel that this is a passion project for those that have set it up. It feels like the early days of fantasy sports where it was a lot of like just passionate people putting in the time and effort to build the platform to like enable it. This is way before what we have now with kind of Yahoo Sports or ESPN, and this is just it's such a community. Like when you read about it, when you engage with it, when you kind of see the people that are involved with it, you can kind of really tell how much they care about it and how much enjoyment it's bringing so many different people. So I didn't want to stop without really acknowledging that point. And yeah, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add, Marcus.
I would just point people to the website, that specifically the FAQs section of the website. I think like every time I have a question regarding some of the rules or how something might work, I go to that FAQ section. It's very thorough. It's excellent resource for just understanding. Steve really lays everything out very simply and comprehensively. So if you're needing a little bit more clarification on anything, go to the FAQ section of the Fantasy Critic website. It's a great resource.
Yeah, and anytime there's like technical questions or even debates about eligibility, or this is not. There are times during the year where games are released in either an odd fashion or they have different types of tags associated with them. If you check out the subreddit or the Discord specifically for Fantasy Critic, you'll find that again, like they go above and beyond to really kind of make sure that people are having a good time with the site. So yeah, thank you to them, and thank you to you, Marcus, for kind of making this all happen. I'm really excited to be doing this with you. So
Yes, and right back at you, buddy.
so do we want to do a little bit of a preview for what's next?
I
Do
think
we want to talk
so.
about do you want to talk about January a little bit
Yeah,
for what's
I mean,
coming up?
I think that now that we've kind of laid out the basics of what Fantasy Critic is, kind of the rules and how you play the game, I think it's really important to give you a little bit of a preview of 2025, or at least from our perspective, what a preview is for the season. So we're going to talk a little bit more on our next episode about draft strategies, as I think John had mentioned earlier. We're also going to talk a little bit about some game picks of ours and previews for things that we're looking forward to. Maybe we'll come up with a few little fun games or ways to talk about some of the upcoming things that we're most looking forward to, or maybe not so looking forward to, or don't think that we'll do so well. So I think that will be the focus of our next episode. So stay tuned for that.
And if there are any questions from the community, I mean, I know it's early days, but we're happy to kind of take those. We're happy to respond to them as part of this monthly podcast. We'll keep an eye out via our various social channels in case there are any questions that come in from our listeners.
Yeah, I think like we're in a few Discord communities, so you can certainly find us there if you happen to know us from those. But I think you can also find me on social media. I don't know how much longer I will be on Twitter. It seems to be melting down at the moment, but you can find me can find me there, at Marcus O'Neill 79. But I also have moved over to the to the happier place on Blue Sky. So it's the same handle there at Marcus O'Neill 79. Do you have any social media you want people to reach out to you if they don't happen to be in a Discord with you, John?
Yeah, you know what? I may not even give the Twitter or X
Yeah,
handle anymore. I'm just making sure that, yeah, so you can find me at John32 on Blue Sky. How about that? And for the various Discord communities, I'm also in the Fantasy Critic Discord. You can find me at John32 there.
awesome.
I just want to thank everybody for listening. This is kind of again, a passion project of ours where we've been talking about this for a long time and kind of a big journey to get here. So, again, thank you for listening to Hype Factor. We're really looking forward to what comes next.
Absolutely. Bye.
Bye.